The crystalline halls stretched into forever, their walls made of frozen starlight, an ancient power that had existed before the first galaxies learned to spin. Thousands of Eternals filled the vast chamber, their forms shifting between solid and pure energy as they watched the trial unfold with cold and distant eyes. Kael Varenthus stood alone in the center of the hall, his wrists bound by chains of compressed gravity that pulled at his very essence. He was young by the standards of his kind, only 12,000 years old, barely more than a child among beings who had watched universes be born and die. His silver hair fell across his face as he kept his head high, refusing to show fear even as the weight of judgment pressed down upon him. The High Arbiter floated above the assembly, a creature of terrible beauty made entirely of cold white light. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, filling the hall like thunder rolling across an endless sky. Kael Varenthus, you stand accused of crimes against the natural order, the Arbiter announced, and the words echoed through dimensions beyond normal space. You have shown sympathy for lesser species. You have spoken the heresy that mortal civilizations possess value beyond their use as servants. You have questioned the sacred right of the Eternal Conclave to rule over all existence. Kael lifted his chin and met the burning gaze of the Arbiter without flinching. I spoke only truth, he said, his voice steady despite the chains that drained his strength. I watched the dying species on the edge of a forgotten galaxy, and I saw them create art and music and love in their final days. They knew they were ending, yet they chose beauty over despair. How can we call ourselves superior when we have forgotten how to feel such things? A gasp rippled through the assembled Eternals. Such words had not been spoken in the halls of power for millions of years. The Arbiter's light flickered with what might have been anger or perhaps something closer to fear. You see, the Arbiter declared to the crowd, he is corrupted beyond salvation. He looks upon mortals and sees equals rather than insects. This sickness cannot be allowed to spread. An ancient Eternal rose from the council seats, her form like a shadow given weight and presence. The punishment is clear, she said in a voice like grinding stone. Death would be a mercy. Let him be cast down to live among the creatures he loves so much. Let him experience mortality firsthand. The hall erupted in voices calling for exile, for punishment, for Kael to suffer as no Eternal had suffered before. He stood silent through it all, knowing that nothing he said would change what was coming. The Conclave had made its decision long before this trial began. This was merely theater, a show of power meant to frighten any others who might dare to think as he did. The Arbiter raised one hand of pure light, and the hall fell instantly silent. Kael Varenthus, you are hereby sentenced to exile. You will be stripped of your cosmic abilities and cast down to Sol 3, a world orbiting an unstable yellow star in a forgotten arm of a minor galaxy. Murmurs of dark satisfaction spread through the crowd. Kael felt his blood run cold as he recognized the designation. Sol 3 was infamous among the Eternals, a planet so hostile that it had been placed under permanent quarantine. The stories told of a world gone mad, where the very environment seemed designed to kill. Sol 3, the Arbiter continued with obvious pleasure in its voice, is classified as a death world of the highest order. The temperature swings between extremes that would shatter lesser beings. The atmosphere is saturated with oxygen, a corrosive and explosive gas. Predators fill every environment, from the deepest waters to the highest peaks. And worst of all, the Arbiter paused for effect. It is home to humans. The name sent a ripple of unease through even the most powerful Eternals present. Humans were spoken of in whispers, a species so violent and unpredictable that the Conclave had forbidden all contact. They were said to wage war against each other constantly, to destroy their own world even as they lived upon it, and to possess a capacity for both cruelty and stubborn survival that defied all logic. You will keep only your immortality, the Arbiter declared, so that your suffering may be prolonged. We expect you to perish within days, broken in body and spirit. But you will not die. You will heal, and you will suffer again forever, until you understand the foolishness of your beliefs. Kale felt the chains tighten as invisible hands began to tear away his powers. The ability to walk between stars, to shape matter with thought, to exist beyond the limits of physical form, all of it was ripped from him like skin being peeled from flesh. He screamed, and his scream echoed through the crystal halls as he was reduced to something small and fragile and terribly mortal. When it was done, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath with lungs that had never needed to work before. Everything hurt. The light was too bright, the air too thick, and he could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his chest like a drum of war. The Arbiter looked down at him with contempt. "Send him to the death world," it commanded. "Let him learn what it means to be mortal among the most dangerous mortals of all." A portal of swirling darkness opened beneath Kale, and he felt himself falling through the space between worlds. Stars blurred past him like streaks of paint across a black canvas. He tumbled through dimensions, stripped of all protection, just a small and fragile thing hurtling toward a planet that the Eternals had deemed too terrible to touch. The last thing he heard before the void took him was the cold laughter of the Conclave, certain that they would never see him again. He crashed into Sol 3 on a warm summer evening. The impact tore through a field of golden wheat, creating a crater of scorched earth and scattered grain. Kale lay at the center, broken and bleeding, staring up at a sky painted orange and pink by a setting sun. He tried to move, and agony exploded through every nerve. His body was damaged in ways he did not understand, and without his powers, he had no way to repair himself. For the first time in 12,000 years, Kale Varentes experienced true helplessness. The sound of an engine reached his ears, followed by voices shouting in a language he did not recognize. Lights approached through the wheat, harsh and artificial, and shapes gathered at the edge of his crater. They were small and soft and impossibly fragile-looking, these humans that the Eternals feared so much. One of them climbed down into the crater, a female with brown skin and dark hair pulled back from her face. She looked at Kale with wide eyes, then called something to the others above. More humans came, bringing strange devices and speaking in urgent tones. Kale expected violence or fear or perhaps worship. What he did not expect was the female reaching out to touch his face with gentle fingers, her expression full of something he could not name. "You are going to be okay," she said, and somehow he understood the words. "We are going to help you." As darkness claimed him, Kale Varentes had one final thought. The Conclave had sent him to die among monsters, but the first human he met was trying to save his life. Perhaps there was more to learn on this death world than anyone had imagined. Kale woke to the smell of chemicals and the sound of machines beeping in steady rhythm. His eyes opened slowly, and bright lights stabbed into his skull like needles of fire. Everything was white and clean and wrong in ways he could not explain. He was lying in a bed, his body wrapped in strange fabrics and connected to tubes that pumped fluids into his veins. The room was small and filled with equipment he did not understand, all of it humming with primitive electrical power that made his skin itch. A door opened and a human female entered, wearing clothes of soft blue and carrying a tray. Kale recognized her as the one from the wheat field, the one who had spoken kindly to him before the darkness came. "You are awake," she said with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "Good. You have been sleeping for 3 days, and we were starting to worry. My name is Maria, and I have been taking care of you." Kale tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. Maria moved quickly, pouring water into a cup and helping him drink. The liquid was cool and sweet and absolutely wonderful against his burning tongue. "Where am I?" he managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You are in a hospital in Montana," Maria replied as she checked the machines beside his bed. "You were in very bad shape when we found you. Broken bones, internal bleeding, burns over half your body. The doctors said they had never seen anyone survive injuries like yours. You must be very strong." Cale almost laughed at that. Strong? He was weaker than he had ever been, stripped of everything that had made him powerful. And yet here he was, alive, being cared for by creatures that his people considered beneath notice. Maria set the tray on a table beside him and lifted a small bowl filled with something that wobbled and shone in the light. "I brought you some food," she said. "It is called Jell-O. It will be easy on your stomach." She offered him a spoon, and Cale tasted the strange substance. It was sweet and cool and melted on his tongue like nothing he had ever experienced. For a moment, he forgot his pain, his exile, his despair, and simply enjoyed the sensation of something new and delightful. "This is good," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. Maria laughed, a sound like bells ringing in a summer breeze. "I am glad you like it. We have many flavors here. Red is my favorite, but green is also very nice." In the days that followed, Cale began to heal. His body repaired itself far faster than the doctors expected, though nothing close to how quickly he would have healed with his powers. Maria visited him every day, teaching him words in her language and answering his endless questions about her world. He learned that humans called their planet Earth, and that they had divided it into hundreds of nations that often fought with each other. He learned that they had thousands of languages and cultures, each one different and strange in its own way. He learned that they lived only 70 or 80 years on average, a span so short that it made his heart ache with sadness. "Does it not frighten you?" he asked Maria one evening as the sun set outside his window. "Knowing that your time is so limited?" Maria thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it also makes everything more precious. Every sunset is beautiful because I will only see a certain number of them. Every person I love is special because our time together will end. Maybe that is strange, but I think knowing we will die makes us live more fully." Those words stayed with Cale as he left the hospital and began to explore the world that the Eternals had called a death trap. He traveled across the nation called America, watching and learning and trying to understand these impossible beings. What he found confused him more with every passing day. He watched two men fight outside a drinking establishment, throwing punches and curses at each other with genuine fury. But when the battle ended, they sat together at the bar and shared drinks like old friends, laughing about the very injuries they had given each other. He saw a small female of advanced age confront a criminal who tried to take her possessions. She produced a weapon and threatened to shoot him, her eyes hard as stone. But when the criminal surrendered and she saw how thin and desperate he looked, she lowered her weapon and invited him inside for food. "You look hungry," she said, as if that explained everything. He attended a festival where humans gathered to eat peppers so hot that they caused physical pain. They sweated and cried and gasped for air, yet they laughed and cheered and begged for more. When Cale asked why they would do such a thing, they simply shrugged and said it was fun. Fun? Deliberate pain was fun? He went to a place called a gym, where humans lifted heavy objects over and over until their muscles screamed with exhaustion. They ran on machines that went nowhere, climbed walls that served no purpose, and pushed their bodies to the breaking point for no reason other than personal satisfaction. He watched a mother chase her small child across a park, both of them screaming with joy even though there was no danger and nothing to gain. He saw an old man sit by a lake for hours, holding a stick with string attached, waiting for fish that might never come, perfectly content in his patience. None of it made sense. These beings were chaotic and contradictory, kind and cruel, wise and foolish, often all at the same time. One evening, Kale sat in a place called a diner, eating something called a cheeseburger and thinking about everything he had seen. A human sat down across from him without asking permission, a large male with gray hair and scars on his hands. "You are not from around here, are you?" the man said with a knowing smile. Kale tensed, wondering if his strangeness had finally been noticed. "What makes you say that?" "You look at everything like you are seeing it for the first time," the man replied. "Like a kid in a candy store, amazed by every little thing." "I am Eddie, by the way." "Kale," he responded, uncertain what else to say. Eddie ordered coffee and studied Kale with eyes that had seen many things. "I do not know where you come from, and I do not care. Everyone is running from something. What matters is what you run toward." "And what do you run toward?" Kale asked. Eddie laughed and spread his hands. "Good food. Good friends. A cold beer after a hard day. The look on a fish's face when you hook him after waiting 3 hours." He leaned forward with a grin. "Life is not about the big things, son. It is about the little things that make the big things worth living through." Kale thought about Maria's Jell-O, about the fighting friends, about the grandmother and her hungry thief. Perhaps Eddie was right. Perhaps the secret of humanity was not in their chaos, but in their ability to find joy within it. The Conclave had sent him here to suffer. Instead, he was beginning to understand something that immortal beings had forgotten long ago. Mortality was not a curse. It was a gift that made every moment precious. Years passed on a death world called Earth, and Kale Lorenthas transformed from a prisoner into a student. He no longer saw himself as an exile suffering punishment. Instead, he had become a scholar studying the most fascinating species in the universe. Every day brought new wonders, new contradictions, and new reasons to marvel at the beings the Eternals had dismissed as primitive and dangerous. Eddie became his guide and his friend, teaching him things that no cosmic power could have revealed. They spent long afternoons by a quiet lake, fishing poles in hand, talking about everything and nothing. "The secret to fishing," Eddie explained one warm summer day, "is patience. You cannot force a fish to bite. You can only put your line in the water and wait. Life is the same way, son. Sometimes you have to trust that good things will come if you just give them time." Kale watched his bobber float on the still water and thought about how different this was from his old existence. As an Eternal, he had commanded reality itself. He could have created fish from nothing, filled oceans with a thought, moved planets to better positions. But none of that would have taught him the simple joy of sitting beside a friend and waiting for something wonderful to happen. "I caught one," he shouted when his line suddenly pulled tight, and Eddie laughed with genuine delight as they worked together to bring in a base that shone silver in the sunlight. His education continued far beyond the lake. Eddie had been a Marine in his youth, a warrior who had seen terrible things, and he introduced Kale to others who had served. "We fight not because we love war," an old soldier named Thomas told him over drinks at a veterans hall, "but because we love what is behind us. Family, home. The freedom to sit in a place like this and complain about the government without anyone kicking down our door. That is worth fighting for." Kale traveled to see the places where humans tested themselves against their own world. He climbed a mountain called Everest with a group of climbers whose ages ranged from 30 to 72. When he asked them why they would risk death on those frozen slopes, they gave him an answer that made no logical sense, yet somehow felt completely right. "Because it is there," the oldest among them said with a grin. He spent time with firefighters who ran into burning buildings while everyone else ran out. He asked them how they found the courage to face flames that could consume them in seconds. "Courage is not about not being afraid," a woman named Jackson told him as she cleaned her gear. "Courage is being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. Besides, someone has to help. Why not me? Why not me? Such a simple question, yet it contained the entire spirit of humanity. They did not wait for others to solve problems. They saw a need and they acted, even when action meant risking everything. Cale studied human history and found it filled with both horror and wonder. They had committed terrible acts against each other, wars and genocides that made his soul weep with sorrow. But they had also created beauty that took his breath away, art and music and poetry that captured emotions he had never known he could feel. They had looked up at the stars and refused to accept that they were out of reach. Within a single lifetime, they had gone from horses and carriages to walking on their own moon. They had built machines to think, split the atom itself, and mapped the very code of life that made them who they were. Every apocalypse predicted, they had defied. Plagues that should have ended them became vaccines. Wars that should have destroyed them became reasons to build organizations dedicated to peace. They fell down again and again, and every single time, they got back up. The years became decades, and Cale began to notice something that brought him great sadness. Eddie was growing old. His hair had gone completely white, his movements had slowed, and his strong hands now trembled when he cast his fishing line. "Do not look at me like that," Eddie said one autumn afternoon when the leaves were falling gold and red around them. "Everyone dies, Cale. That is just how it works." "It should not be that way," Cale replied, his voice thick with emotions he still struggled to name. "You deserve more time. You deserve forever." Eddie shook his head and smiled the wise smile of someone who had made peace with truth. "Forever would be a curse, son. Can you imagine getting tired of sunsets? Bored with the taste of good food? So used to your friends that you forget to appreciate them?" He put a weathered hand on Cale's shoulder. "I've lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. I have seen beautiful things and done work that mattered. That is enough. That is more than enough." 3 months later, Eddie passed away in his sleep with a smile on his face. Cale wept at the funeral, tears streaming down his cheeks as humans gathered to share stories and laughter and grief. He had never cried before coming to Earth. Eternals did not cry. But as he stood beside Eddie's grave and watched the wooden box descend into the ground, he understood that tears were not weakness. They were love that had no other way to express itself. "He talked about you all the time," Eddie's daughter said to Cale after the service. "He said you were the most curious person he ever met. He said teaching you things made him feel like his life had purpose." Purpose. Eddie had spent his final years giving wisdom to a lost exile, and it had made him happy. Not power or wealth or glory, just the simple act of sharing what he knew with someone who wanted to learn. Cale walked back to the lake where they had fished together so many times. He sat on the old wooden dock and watched the water turn orange and pink as the sun went down. 12,000 years of existence, and he had never truly understood what it meant to live. The conclave in their crystal halls had forgotten. They had become so focused on forever that they had lost sight of now. But humans knew. They knew that every moment mattered because every moment ended. They built and loved and struggled not in spite of death but because of it. Death was not their enemy, it was their teacher, reminding them every day to make their short time count. "Thank you, Eddie," Cale whispered to the fading light. "Thank you for everything." He stayed by the lake until the stars came out. The same stars that had once been his home. Somewhere up there, the Eternals watched and waited, certain that he was suffering. They had no idea that he had found something worth more than all their cosmic power. He had found humanity, and humanity had taught him what it truly meant to be alive. A century had passed since Cale Varenthus fell from the sky into a wheat field in Montana. He had changed much in that time, though his face remained young and his body stayed strong. The immortality the Conclave had left him as a curse had become something else entirely, a gift that allowed him to watch generations of humans live and love and leave their mark upon the world. He had built a small diner on a lonely road in New Mexico, a place where travelers could stop for food and rest and conversation. The sign outside read, "Eddie's Place," in honor of the friend who had taught him what really mattered. Cale cooked the food himself, having learned the art from dozens of teachers over the decades, and he took pride in every meal he served. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the emissary arrived. Cale was cleaning the counter when the air in the corner of the diner began to shimmer with familiar energy. A figure stepped through the distortion, tall and elegant, wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight. The emissary looked around the humble establishment with obvious disgust, taking in the worn booths and faded photographs and the smell of frying onions. "Cale Varanthus," the emissary said in a voice that echoed with cosmic authority. "I've been sent by the High Conclave to confirm your status. They expected to find you dead or broken. They did not expect to find you serving food to mortals." Cale smiled and set down his cleaning rag. "Would you like something to eat? I make an excellent green chili cheeseburger. Best in 3-star systems, though I admit I am biased." The emissary stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "You dare to joke? You have been exiled to a death world for 100 years. You should be a shell of your former self, begging for mercy." "Please, sit," Cale said, gesturing to a booth. "You have come a long way. The least I can do is offer hospitality." Something in his calm confidence made the emissary hesitate. This was not the broken creature the Conclave had expected to find. This was someone at peace, someone who had found something that the powerful immortals back home had lost long ago. Curiosity overcame contempt, and the emissary sat down. Cale went to the kitchen and prepared 2 plates, loading them with his signature burgers, crispy fries, and extra green chili. He set them on the table and slid into the booth across from his guest. "Try it," he encouraged. "Trust me." The emissary looked at the food with suspicion, then took a small bite. The expression that crossed their face was priceless shock, then confusion, then something that might have been delight. "This is extraordinary," the emissary admitted. "What is it?" "It is called a cheeseburger," Cale explained. "Ground beef, melted cheese, vegetables, and a local pepper called green chili. The humans invented it. They invent all sorts of amazing things when you give them time." They ate in silence for a few minutes, and Cale watched the emissary's resistance slowly crumble with each bite. Good food had a way of opening minds, he had learned. There was a reason so much human bonding happened around meals. "You have changed," the emissary finally said. "You are not the angry young Eternal who stood before the Conclave speaking heresies. What happened to you on this world?" Cale considered the question carefully. "I learned," he said simply. "I learned that the Conclave was wrong about everything. These mortals they dismiss as dangerous primitives are the most remarkable beings in the universe. They live such short lives, yet they fill those lives with more meaning than we have found in millions of years." He reached under the table and pulled out a thick stack of papers, bound together with care and worn from many readings. The cover bore a title written in both the language of the Eternals and in English. "What is this?" the emissary asked. "A gift for the Conclave," Cale replied. 300 pages. I have been working on it for decades. I call it Eartha Visitor's Guide, with a subtitle, Caution, Contents May Cause Existential Crisis. The emissary opened the document and began to read. The first chapter was titled Surviving First Contact and contained detailed instructions on how to interact with humans without getting hurt. Rule 1, the emissary read aloud. When a human offers to shake your hand, do not resist. They will attempt to crush your fingers. This is not an attack, but a test of strength disguised as greeting. Squeeze back firmly, but do not break their bones, as this will be considered rude. Kale nodded. Keep reading. It gets better. The emissary flipped through the pages, eyes growing wider with each section. There were chapters on human competitions, and why you should never accept a challenge that begins with "I bet you cannot." Explanations of their inexplicable relationship with capsaicin and caffeine. Warnings about something called sports fans during events called playoffs. One chapter was simply titled Florida, with a subheading that read, "Do not engage under any circumstances." What is Florida? The emissary asked. A region in the southeastern part of this continent, Kale explained. Normal rules do not apply there. I cannot explain why. No one can. Just trust me and stay away. Another section detailed human endurance, their ability to keep moving long after their bodies should have failed. It explained how they had chased prey across entire continents in ancient times, simply refusing to stop until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. It described their capacity for spite, a force that could motivate them to achieve impossible things simply because someone had said they could not. The final chapter was titled A Warning, and the emissary read it with increasing concern. Do not invade, it said. Do not threaten. Do not underestimate. This species conquered their own death world, and did it while inventing pizza and arguing about whether a hot dog counts as a sandwich. They have been fighting each other for thousands of years, which means they have been practicing for you. They will sacrifice themselves without hesitation for causes they believe in. They have split the atom and walked on their moon, and they are just getting started. Leave them alone, or learn why every species that has tried to control them has failed. The emissary closed the document and looked at Kale with something that might have been fear. You cannot seriously expect the Conclave to take this as a threat. We are Eternals. We have conquered galaxies. I am not threatening anyone, Kale said calmly. I am warning. There is a difference. The Conclave can do whatever they want with that guide. Ignore it, laugh at it, burn it. But if they ever decide to come to Earth with hostile intentions, they will wish they had read more carefully. He leaned back in his seat and smiled. Now, would you like some pie? I make an excellent apple pie. Maria's original recipe. She taught me herself before she passed away. The emissary stayed for 3 more hours, eating pie and asking questions and struggling to process everything they had learned. When they finally returned to the Conclave, they carried the guide with them. Kale watched the shimmer of departure fade, and then went back to cleaning his counter. Somewhere in the cosmic halls of power, immortal beings would soon be reading about humanity through the eyes of someone who had truly come to understand them. He hoped they would listen. He really did. But if they did not, well, humanity had survived everything else the universe had thrown at them. They would survive the Eternals too. Of that, Cal had no doubt at all. The High Arbiter read the tourist guide 3 times before casting it aside with a sound of pure contempt. This is madness, it declared to the assembled conclave. Kale has gone insane on that primitive rock. He actually believes these mortal creatures pose a threat to us. Laughter echoed through the crystalline halls, cold and ancient and utterly confident. The Eternals had ruled the cosmos since before most stars were born. They had crushed empires that spanned thousands of worlds, extinguished civilizations that had reached heights of power and glory that would take most species millions of years to achieve. What could one tiny planet of short-lived beings possibly do against such might? He mocks us with this document, the Shadow Eternal said, her form rippling with anger. He writes about their food and their contests and their stubbornness as if these things were weapons. He has forgotten what true power looks like. The Arbiter's light pulsed with decision. Then we shall remind him. And we shall teach these humans what happens to species that draw the attention of the Conclave. Send the subjugation fleet. Burn their cities. Crush their spirits. Let Kale watch the creatures he loves so much kneel before us. 200 warships departed for Sol 3, each one capable of destroying entire planets. Their commanders expected an easy victory, perhaps a few hours of cleansing fire followed by the grateful surrender of a terrified population. They arrived in Earth's orbit on a clear summer morning. Their first sign of trouble came when one of the lead vessels was struck by a nuclear missile. The weapon had been launched from a platform hidden in the asteroid belt, placed there decades ago by humans who had looked at the stars and thought, what if someone comes uninvited? The explosion barely scratched the Eternal ship, but it sent a message. Humanity knew they were coming, and humanity was not going to make this easy. Within minutes, every military on Earth mobilized. Old enemies became instant allies as generals who had spent careers preparing to fight. Each other turned their attention to the sky. Fighter jets scrambled from 100 nations. Submarines surfaced with targeting systems aimed upward. Armies that had never worked together suddenly moved as one. The Conclave fleet descended expecting sheep. They found wolves. Human weapons were primitive compared to Eternal technology, but they were used with a creativity and viciousness that the invaders had never encountered. Pilots flew suicide runs, crashing their aircraft into vulnerable points of enemy vessels. Tanks fired upward in coordinated barrages. Civilians with hunting rifles took shots at anything that came close enough to hit. One fighter pilot named Rodriguez flew her damaged jet directly into the engine core of an Eternal dreadnought while her radio played something called Highway to Hell at maximum volume. Her sacrifice took out a ship that had conquered 12 star systems. A group of elderly women who called themselves a knitting circle somehow managed to hack into the alien communication network. They flooded Eternal channels with cat videos and cooking shows in a song about never giving up that drove the invaders nearly mad with confusion. And somewhere in the chaos, a man from Florida stole a landing craft. No one knew how. No one could explain it. But security footage showed him driving away in the alien vehicle while shouting something about it being gator season. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours against a fleet that had conquered galaxies. 6 hours of humans fighting with everything they had, using tactics the Eternals had never seen, fueled by a fury that defied all logic. They knew they were outmatched. They knew they might lose. They fought anyway, because that was what humans did. When the Conclave fleet finally retreated in disarray, they had lost 40 ships and countless soldiers. Earth had suffered terrible damage, cities burned, millions dead, scars that would take generations to heal. But they had won. Against all odds, against an enemy with technology thousands of years beyond their own, humanity had stood together and refused to fall. 3 days later, Kale Varentas stood once again in the crystalline halls, but everything was different now. He did not stand alone. Beside him was a delegation of humans, survivors and heroes and ordinary people who had become extraordinary when their world needed them. Among them was an elderly woman in a nurse's uniform, her hair white with age, but her eyes still bright with the kindness that had once offered a frightened god a cup of jello. Maria had lived long enough to see Kale's warning proven right. The High Arbiter floated before them, its light dimmer than before, flickering with something that might have been fear. The assembled Eternals watched in silence, still struggling to understand how their mighty fleet had been bloodied by beings they considered insects. "You sent me to die on a world of mortals," Kale said, his voice carrying through the great hall. "Instead, they taught me how to live. I tried to warn you. I wrote 300 pages explaining exactly who and what they were. You laughed and called me mad." He gestured to the humans beside him. "Look at them. Really look. They live maybe 80 years if they are lucky. They are fragile and small, and they know they are going to die. But that knowledge does not break them, it makes them strong. They squeeze every drop of meaning from every moment because they know their moments are numbered. He stepped forward, and the Arbiter actually retreated. You have existed for millions of years, and what have you done with all that time? You sit in your crystal halls and judge and conquer and feel superior. But when have you last created something beautiful just because you could? When have you last loved someone knowing you would lose them? When have you last fought for something you believed in, even knowing you might fail? The silence in the hall was absolute. Maria stepped forward, leaning on a cane but standing straight. I have a message for your conclave, she said, in a voice that wavered with age but rang with authority. We did not ask for this fight. We did not want it. We were happy on our little world, living our little lives, loving our families, and arguing about silly things like whether a hot dog is a sandwich. She smiled, and somehow that smile was more frightening than all the weapons humanity had used. But you came anyway. You thought we were weak because we die. You were wrong. We're strong because we die. Every sunrise is precious because we will not see unlimited sunrises. Every person we love matters because we will not have them forever. And every threat to what we cherish will be met with everything we have. This is your only warning, Kale concluded. Leave humanity alone. Watch them from a distance if you must. Marvel at their contradictions and their chaos, but do not interfere. Because the next message they send will not be a tourist guide. It will be a fleet. The conclave deliberated for 3 days. When they emerged, they announced something unprecedented in cosmic history. Sol 3 was designated a protected sovereign system. No Eternal would be permitted within 100 light years. Humanity would be left alone to grow and develop and eventually reach the stars on their own terms. It was not victory. It was acknowledgement. The Eternals had finally understood what Kale had been trying to tell them all along, that mortality was not weakness, but strength, and that the creatures they had dismissed were worthy of respect. Kale returned to Earth with the human delegation. He went back to his diner in New Mexico and fired up the grill. There were cheeseburgers to make and stories to share and a world to rebuild. But first, he drove to a quiet lake in Montana. He sat on an old wooden dock and watched the sun set over still water. In his hand, he held a photograph of a gray-haired man with scars on his hands and wisdom in his eyes. We did it, Eddie, he said to the fading light. They finally listened. A fish jumped in the distance, breaking the surface with a splash of silver. Somewhere, Kale liked to think, his old friend was laughing. He stayed until the stars came out, the same stars that had once been his prison and were now his home. Then he got up and walked back to his truck. There was a lot of work ahead, a lot of healing and building and learning still to do. But that was okay. That was the human way. And after a century among them, Kale Varentes would not have it any other way.